So it's a great pleasure to be here with you in Brussels to talk about stress-free schools. It's obvious that there's a great deal of interest in stress-free schools. Did anyone here find school stress-free when you were at school? No, obviously this is something you would like to have. You might think it's a dream, but it isn't. There's a story that a Catholic student was talking to a Hindu student, and the Hindu student says to the Catholic student, well, what happens in your religion after you die? And the Catholic says, well, we go to purgatory if we're not perfect, and then we work through our problems, and then we go to heaven. He said, well, what happens in your religion? So the Hindu says, oh, well, after we die, we get reincarnated back on earth. And the Catholic says, that's terrible. I'd have to go back to school. So that's the feeling I think a lot of people have about school. It's not as satisfying as it should be. So what we're going to do tonight is to show how education can be truly stress-free and much more productive than it is today. Now, with stress-free schooling, we don't have to change very much in education. Students will still be learning mathematics, languages, arts, history, philosophy, economics, all of the things that are taught today. But there'll be one very important addition, and that is the addition of the full development of consciousness of the student. What's been missing in education is the development of higher states of consciousness of the student. And what I mean by consciousness is alertness, wakefulness, intelligence, creativity, receptivity, breadth of comprehension, all of the qualities that make a great student. That's what's been missing from education today. So let's think for a moment, what is fundamental in education? If you have a room full of intellectually gifted students, but none of them are conscious, then not very much is going to get learnt. So we can see that consciousness is more fundamental than the intellect. And is anyone here a teacher? Yes, I could ask you a question. That's great. What do you think are the two most difficult times of the week to have to teach a class?
I have a more easy job because I give lesson to adults.
Oh, okay.
Always okay.
Always okay.
Yes.
Adults, that's great. All right.
Well, the morning and the evening is better. The afternoon is terrible.
Okay, after lunch.
After lunch is more difficult.
Yeah, because they have a liquid lunch in Brussels, probably. So if you were a school teacher, though, what would you think are the two times of the week that would be most difficult?
For me, but now.
Yeah.
My
No, imagine you were a school teacher. What would be?
For younger
Yeah,
children then.
yeah.
I think beginning of the week.
Yes, all right. And?
And maybe Friday.
Yes, okay, good. I didn't pay you to say that, did I? Okay, so the answer came out that the feeling was first thing on a Monday morning is probably the most difficult time, and again, last thing Friday afternoon. So that means that already teachers know intuitively that students come to school in different states of consciousness. So on a Monday morning, the back row of the classroom could be in the sleeping state of consciousness. Sleeping is a state of human consciousness, whereby you're still alive, but you're not aware of anything, right? If someone says to you, did you have a good night's sleep? And you say, yes, it was great. What do you mean? You mean you don't remember a thing about it, right? Someone could have been wheeling you around Brussels, showing you the sights, and you wouldn't have known. So sleeping is a state of consciousness whereby you have no awareness and you have rest in the physiology. And then Friday afternoon, the students might be in the dreaming state of consciousness, where you're declining Dutch verbs on the blackboard and they're skiing in the Alps as far as they're concerned, because dreaming is another state of consciousness where you have rapid eye movements and you may be going help, help, or whatever. That's a different state of consciousness with illusory awareness. And then there's the waking state of consciousness, which I think everyone is in now. Looks good at the back. Where you have awareness of outside objects and you have activity in the body. So those are the three states of consciousness that everyone is familiar with. And on a continuum, going from the least awareness to the greatest awareness. We would say that sleeping is the first state of consciousness with the lowest awareness. Then dreaming with a little bit more awareness, albeit illusory. And then waking, where we have awareness of outside objects. Now, tonight we're going to learn that actually there are 7 states of human consciousness, not just 3. And on that continuum, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th states of consciousness have greater awareness, alertness, breadth of comprehension, receptivity, creativity, and intelligence than the first 3. So let's look at the foundations of consciousness-based education, what we mean by higher states of consciousness. I'll introduce the research that's been done over the last 50 years. I'll talk about the application in schools, the application for developing full mental potential, better health, better social behavior, and then how we can improve the quality of life in the whole world through consciousness-based education. So firstly, let's look at the foundation of consciousness-based education. If we analyze education in the simplest possible way, we could say that there's a 3-fold structure to education. There's the knower, there is the process of knowing, and then there is the known. And all of you here went to education conventionally, just like I did, and you realize immediately that most of the emphasis in education today is on the known, right? You were always taking exams to find out how much do you know. Now, if you think of the totality of human knowledge, how much of the totality of knowledge does the average student actually know? Well, don't all shout at once. Obviously, it's not very much. And that's a problem, because if you go to any kindergarten class, what you'll find are a group of 6-year-olds who want to know everything, right? Has anyone here ever had to spend a day with a 6-year-old? Right? It's absolutely exhausting. They never stop asking why. Why? You can't leave. It's probably illegal to leave a group of kindergarten students on their own without an adult. Why? Not because they're malicious, but because within 2 minutes someone will be putting the scissors into the power outlet to test Ohm's law. Someone will be swinging on the curtains to test the tensile strength of the curtain rod. There's this insatiable curiosity for knowledge. Every human being is born with the desire for total knowledge. But if you take me to meet a group of 16-year-olds, and we can do this as an experiment if you like, it's a fairly different atmosphere. Usually, if you're standing in front of a group of 16-year-olds and you start to get really excited about some area of knowledge, a hand goes up and they'll say, "Are we going to be tested on this?" Because by the time they're 16, they've given up wanting to know everything. What they want to know is, what do I need to get through the test so I can get the piece of paper and get out of education? So the majority of students, by the time they're 18, they've dropped out of education completely. And if you go on to university, do you end up knowing everything? No. As you go higher in education, you learn more and more about less and less. So by the time you get a PhD, you know almost everything about almost nothing. And that fundamental desire for total knowledge remains unfulfilled. So just take it from me, PhDs act as if they know everything, but believe me, they don't. Even the most highly educated people in society only know a tiny fraction of the totality of knowledge. And that's the problem, because when our desire for total knowledge is not fulfilled, then we find education not satisfying, and that lack of fulfillment of desires creates stress, and then the whole thing starts to go downhill from there. So what we're going to see tonight is how we can deliver the fruit of all knowledge to every single student in a very simple way. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that there's more than one component to education. In addition to the known, there's also the process of knowing. Now, how do we know anything? You have to see the teacher, you have to hear the teacher, you have to touch the sculpture, taste the cooking, smell the farmyard, whatever discipline you're in, you're using your 5 senses. But has anyone here ever taken a course to refine the senses? Has anyone taken a course to improve your sense of smell or lower your auditory threshold? No? No. So it's not really all that common in education today to, as William Blake would have put it, cleanse the windows of perception. Because if we cleanse the windows of perception, we'll see the universe as it really is. It's infinite. And then once the information is in your brain, it has to be analyzed, it has to be synthesized. So imagine if you have a student who's born with a brain that's good at analysis, then that student is probably good at mathematics. But where's the mathematics teacher today who can take a student who's not good at mathematics and transform that student into a great mathematician? It's because they don't have the tools to be able to develop those neuronal circuits in the brain responsible for analysis. And then we have finally the knower. Again, the most important part of education. And that, again, what I mean by that is the level of consciousness of the student. How awake, how alert, how intelligent, how creative, how receptive to knowledge, what is their breadth of comprehension. So once we have a system that develops higher states of consciousness in the student, cleanses the windows of perception, we can deliver the fruit of all knowledge to every student. So how do we do that? Well, as I mentioned before, there are 7 states of human consciousness. There's sleeping, dreaming, and waking. And in waking, we have awareness of outside objects. So this girl here could say, I am aware of the book. But back in 1970, Dr. Robert Keith Wallace published a landmark paper in Science magazine, and in that journal he reported a 4th state of consciousness, a 4th major state of consciousness known as transcendental consciousness. And in transcendental consciousness, which is easily achieved through the technique of transcendental meditation, we close our eyes, the awareness settles down to finer levels of thinking, we transcend the subtlest impulse of thought and experience that field of pure, silent awareness at the source of thought. So the mind is quiet, but fully awake. So just as in waking, you could say you have the experience of, I am aware of the book. In transcendental consciousness, you have the experience of, I am aware. Pure awareness. And because the mind and body are intimately related, as the mental activity settles down to a state of least excitation of consciousness, the body settles into a deep level of rest and relaxation. And in that deep level of rest, the body is able to revitalize and rejuvenate itself and dissolve deeply rooted stress and strain and fatigue that are not released during sleep. So physiologists are saying today that to become a fully developed human being, you must have regular experience of these 4 states of consciousness. Obviously, you have to have regular sleeping, that's obvious. You have to have regular dreaming, otherwise you'll go psychotic. You have to have regular waking, otherwise there's no life. But you also need to have regular experience of transcendental consciousness. Otherwise, as we'll see, the brain fails to fully develop and the body accumulates stress. And this is the root cause of this epidemic of stress-related disorders that is plaguing our modern society and threatening to bankrupt every country in the Western world over the next 25 years. Because doctors are saying today that probably 80 to 90% of all of the patients they see in their offices every day have some problem that is related or aggravated by stress. So it's a very, very great discovery, this 4th state of consciousness. So what we do in education then is the first thing we do in the morning when the students come into school or university is they sit for 15 minutes, they practice the transcendental meditation technique, which is effortless, natural, any child can learn it. It's not a religion, doesn't involve any philosophy or change in lifestyle, just a simple technique that children can learn no matter what their intellectual capacity. and they sit for 15 minutes and they practice transcendental meditation. The mind dives deep within to the source of their total creative potential. The body gets deeply rested, and after 15 minutes they come out refreshed, rejuvenated, revitalized, more clear-headed, more intelligent, more creative, and then they study mathematics and art and science and philosophy, play sports. But they're doing it now from a higher level of consciousness. And this has been very successfully introduced at schools around the world, and in fact has been studied in over 600 scientific studies conducted at over 250 research institutes and universities all over the world. And what's been found is quite remarkable, that this one simple technique gives a wide range of benefits. So, for example, it develops the total brain, and I'll explain what that means. That's a new concept in education, developing the whole brain. It increases creativity and intelligence. Now, you might think, oh, if I stay at university longer, then I'll become more intelligent. But actually, if you look at the research, if you take something like fluid intelligence, then fluid intelligence increases until you're about 18. Then it starts to level off. And then after about 30, it starts a slow but inexorable decline. So if you take too long over your PhD, you'll be less intelligent when you get it than you were in high school. That just tells us there's something missing from education. It improves job performance, reduces stress and anxiety, promotes health and longevity, enhances relationships, and promotes peace. So we might ask, how can one simple thing have such a global range of benefits? And that is because this one simple thing is fundamental. It's developing higher states of consciousness, and consciousness is the most fundamental level of life. If you weren't conscious, you wouldn't exist. And if you did exist, you wouldn't know you existed. So you have to have consciousness for a successful life. So this is the new face of education. Now, this may look very unusual. If you want your son or daughter to go to the University of Brussels, do you want them to spend their time at school sitting around with their eyes shut? Right? I mean, a person like me who was brought up conventionally, you'd look at this and say, well, you can't have this. This child could spend this time studying differential calculus or learning Mandarin Chinese or something useful. But, you know, there's always more than one way to do something. There's the obvious way, and then there's the more subtle but more effective way. So if I were to give you an arrow, and I say, I want this arrow in a target 100 meters away, you can run 100 meters with the arrow and stick it in the target. And from the outside, it looks like you're one of these really hard-working, get up and go, let's get the job done kind of people. But there's a better way, and that is to use a technique. And that technique is the bow. Now, think what happens when you fire a bow. You put the arrow on the bow, and it's resting, but it's useless. If you let the arrow go from there, you'll just shoot yourself in the foot. What you have to do is not just have the arrow in a state of silence, but you have to draw the arrow in the opposite direction to where you want it to go. You take it to a state of dynamic silence, where it's at its full potential. And then you let go. And then the arrow hits the target. And that's what these students are doing. Their awareness is diving spontaneously within to the source of their total creative potential. And then when they come out of meditation, that increased creativity and intelligence gets applied to everything they put their mind to. So, for example, at Maharishi School, where I've been director for over 20 years now, it constantly amazes me every year. I think, could they possibly win anything more? And every year they do. And it's amazing. Like, a study in the journal Education showed that students entering Maharishi School are about average. But by the time they get into high school, year after year, classes score in the top 1% of all the schools in the United States, with no entrance exams to the school. Our students win the state science fair. Last year, every student from Iowa who went to the International Science Fair was from Maharishi School. They've won the American High School Mathematics exam 4 years in a row. They've won more of the top awards in speech and drama in the state of Iowa since they started competing in 1988 than any other school in the state. Won 17 state tennis championships, the history fair, the international photography competitions. But I think the most amazing achievement is their creativity. There are international problem-solving competitions called Destination Imagination and Odyssey of the Mind, which schools all over the world compete in, and they have to solve a problem. They have about 3 months to solve a problem and present the solution to the judges, and then on the day of the competition, they're given what's called a spontaneous problem, and they have 8 minutes to solve it in front of the judges. And Maharishi School students have won the World Championships now 4 times, which is more often than any other school in the world. And also they've had more top 10 finishes in the world finals than any other school in the world. And I was in Poland and I met with the director of Destination Imagination for Poland, and she said to me, "Where do you keep finding these creative students year after year?" And I said, I don't go out and find creative students. We take any student, but we teach them how to find the source of their infinite creativity and intelligence deep within themselves. That's the secret of success. So what's happening here is something that is fundamental. And so let's take a moment and consider what is the most fundamental level of life. And then let's go further and say, what is the most fundamental level of the entire universe? And today in 2013, we can answer that question. Let's look at the answer firstly from the field of physics. Physics is the most objective science. Physicists don't like things that are alive. They don't like to study cats and dogs and things that bite and scratch. They like things that don't run away and mess up your experiment. So what happens in physics? Totally objective. And imagine how physics started. Maybe 500 years ago, a couple of people were sitting together and one said to the other, "You know, Jacques, I'm wondering, what is this universe in which we live? Where did it come from? What is it made of? Where is it going?" And so Philippe said, "Well, why don't we find out?" And that's what they did. They built telescopes, microscopes, particle accelerators, and they began to probe more and more deeply into the objective universe outside of themselves. And what they found was quite surprising. On the surface, nature seems to be infinitely diverse and constantly changing. Everyone in this room looks different, and you look different to the projector, and the projector looks different to a tree, and a tree looks different to a star or a galaxy. You have this infinite diversity and constant change. This room looks different than it did an hour ago, or a week ago, or 10,000 years ago. That's the experience of the universe in which we live. But as you probe deeper to finer levels of physical existence, you find that the universe is structured in layers. So beneath the surface level of diversity, there's a layer of molecules. And then there's a layer of atoms. And then there's a layer of nuclei. And then there's the subnuclear level of quarks and gluons. And as you go deeper, you find that nature becomes progressively more unified. So by the time you get to a level about 1/100th the radius of the proton, you find that there are 4 fundamental forces of nature and 4 fundamental categories of particle plus the Higgs boson. And over the last 40 years, physicists have found that at deeper and deeper levels, nature becomes progressively more unified, culminating today in the discovery of completely mathematically consistent quantum field theories. It's a supreme achievement of the human intellect that we can now write down one equation, and that equation can predict very accurately the universe in which we live today. So if you ask a physicist today, what is the nature of the universe? They'll say, well, actually, there's only one thing that the whole universe is made of, there's one single unified field, which is completely non-changing. It's eternal. It was there before the Big Bang. It'll be there after the Big Crunch or the Big Rip, depending which cosmological model you fancy today. A non-changing field which interacts with itself and vibrates within itself, and then those vibrations appear as electrons, protons, atoms, molecules, DNA, human beings, human brains, beamers, trees, stars, galaxies. The whole universe, every one and everything, is the play and display of one single unified field. So it truly is a universe. All of diversity is unified. Now, let's suppose that you were that student in kindergarten who survived high school, like I did, and you go on to university with the desire to know everything, and you go to the registrar at the University of Brussels and say, you know, here I am, I'm 18, I want to know everything. And the registrar would say, well, I'm afraid you can't. You have to take Mathematics 101 or Literature 101, or in your case, I'd recommend Psychology 101 because you have very strange ideas. And you wonder, well, you know, maybe I'll take physics, maybe I'll study electronics. I could study electronics for my whole life. Would I know everything? No, I probably wouldn't be able to pass an exam in nuclear physics. And over here I could draw a diagram showing how all of chemistry comes from the unified field, how all of biology comes from the unified field, how all of economics comes from the unified field, where no one seems to know anything about any of the boxes, as far as I can see today. The point is that we could ask the question, you obviously can't gain total knowledge on the diversified level of knowledge because it's infinite. But is there one thing that you could know by which everything else could be known? Yeah? You can see it on the chart. One thing you could know by which everything else could be known, and that would be the unified field. If you could know the unified field, you'd have the source of all of the knowledge, all the information, all the organizing power of the entire diverse universe. Think of it like this. You could have a tree where you had leaves, and you could have a PhD in photosynthesis studying the leaves, and you could have fruits and branches and petals, and you could have all this infinite diversity of the tree with hundreds of PhDs devoting their lives to understanding bark and sap and all of this. But a little child can hold the seed of the tree in the palm of their hand. And if you've got the seed, then you've got all the knowledge and information of the whole tree. The unified field can be looked upon as the seed of the universe. The entire universe comes from the interaction of the unified field with itself. So if you know the unified field, you'd know the field of total knowledge. But the question is, how do you get at it? Because if you've ever studied physics, you know, molecular physics is one thing, atomic physics is another thing, quantum mechanics is a little more abstract, quantum field theory is more abstract, superstring theory is more abstract, M theory is more abstract. It starts to get more and more difficult to comprehend these subtler levels of nature. And even if you wrote down all of the equations of the unified field, then what use would they be? Like if you spent 20 years from now, if you got inspired by this lecture, which you won't, I'm sure, but if you did, I'm just playing if you were to get inspired by the lecture and think, oh, I'm going to learn about the unified field and study physics, and you spend 20 years working all the equations out and understanding everything, then where have you got? Would these equations make you wealthy? No, physicists don't get paid very much. Would they make you healthy? No, your doctor wouldn't understand them. Would they make you happy? Would they make your spouse happy? Almost certainly not if you just spent 20 years locked in your office working on equations. So the point is, they're actually great intellectual satisfaction, but not much use. But here's the €1,000,000 question, as we say. We've seen that the unified field is the source of atoms and molecules and DNA and human beings and human brains it must also be the source of human consciousness. The unified field is not only the source of objective existence, by definition, it must also be the source of subjective existence, mind, intellect, feelings, emotions, intuition, ego. They're all expressions of the unified field. So what if, instead of, or in addition to, exploring nature at finer levels outside of ourselves, what if we close our eyes and we practice this simple technique of meditation, transcendental meditation, and we experience finer and finer levels of a thought inside of ourselves. Transcend the subtlest impulse of thought and experience that field of pure, silent awareness at the source of thought. Now you might think, well, this sounds very difficult. I could never sit and meditate. My mind is always running off here, running off there. I'm a busy, practical person. I couldn't do it. But think for a moment. The mind is like an ocean. When you go down to the ocean, what are you struck by first? The beauty of the waves crashing on the shore. So you have a wave comes and a wave goes, and a wave comes and a wave goes. And you know, if the ocean has the ability to be active, it naturally has the ability to be less active and less active. And when the subtlest impulse of the waves is transcended, then you have one silent, unbounded ocean. But that silent state of the ocean is the source of every possible wave. Just like that in the mind. A thought comes, a thought goes, a thought comes, a thought goes. Maybe you're having a rough day and you have lots of thoughts, just like the ocean would have lots of waves. But if your mind has the ability to be active, it naturally has the ability to be less active, and when the subtlest impulse of thought is transcended, you experience one silent, unbounded ocean of consciousness. And that silent state of awareness is the source of every possible thought. And it's the experience of the source of thought that has been missing from education for thousands of years. Now, what would be the value of giving a student the experience of the source of thought? Well, maybe you're that student. I had this experience. You probably had this experience. Usually you have this experience in second year university. What did you study in university?
Speech teaching.
Speech teaching. Very good. So you were sitting in second year university studying a book called The Introduction to Speech Therapy, right? And you're sitting there thinking, you know, I'm learning a lot about speech therapy, but I wish I knew more about music and art and philosophy and history and economics and cosmology. And you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to go down to the library and lock myself in, read every single book in the library, and become a fully educated human being. But of course you never did that, because you get to the library, you open the door, there's 10 million books, and you just feel depressed. So where do you go from here? Well, what you have to do is realize that those books came from somewhere. Where does a book come from? Obviously, a book comes from a printer, and the printer is attached to a word processor, and the word processor has a keyboard, and the keyboard is activated by the fingers of an author, and the fingers of the author are setting down the thoughts in the mind of the author. Every book in the library is actually fossilized human thought. And students spend their whole careers studying the fragmented, fossilized thoughts of other people, and they never have the experience of the source of their own thinking. But if all the knowledge in the library came from thought, then the source of human thought must be the source of total knowledge. And that was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's great insight, that total knowledge is structured in consciousness at the source of thought of every human being. And the goal of education is to give the experience to the student of the source of total knowledge within. So you give them the experience of total knowledge, and then from there you give them the partial knowledge. So the parts of knowledge are always connected to the totality of knowledge. Now, this is not a new idea. If you take the word for education in English or in French, education, it comes from Latin, educere. It means I lead out, or to lead out. It doesn't mean to cram in, right? It means exactly the opposite. It means to lead out. If you speak German, the word is Aufbildung, which means building out. Or in Dutch, Underwijs. What does Underwijs mean? It means underneath is the wisdom, right? I was just in Slovenia where the word is učenje. And ocha is the eye and učenje means to be looking within. I haven't been to a country yet where education means cramming in. Of course, I haven't been to a country yet where they don't cram in. It's that the meaning of education has been lost. What did the ancient Greeks say was the most important thing in education? What does the Delphic Oracle inscription say? Know yourself. Now, where is yourself? Who are you? Who am I, they say. Yes, know yourself. Well, where is yourself? Well, here's the surface level of the mind, the level of the thinking mind. Now, if I were to meet you, let's say, I've got to be very careful here. If I met you, say, 15 years ago, you'd say, I'm a student. And I meet you today, you say, I'm a mother. And I meet you in 30 years, and you say, I'm a grandmother. So when I say, you know, who are you, what do you do, that changes all the time. In America, you meet someone one week, they say, I'm a Republican, and the next week they've changed their mind and they're a Democrat. Who knows anymore who they are? But that's on the surface level of change. But actually, here, yourself is never changing. It's eternal. It's unbounded. It was there before the Big Bang. It'll be there after the Big Crunch. That's the non-changing level of the self. So, know yourself means know the unified field within, and that's the source of total knowledge. And every single child has that field within. This is a system of education to unfold the inner genius of every single student. Now think in Belgium every year. How many students graduate from gymnasium? Maybe 100,000? How many of those 100,000 will be recognized by society as a genius? Yeah? Well, don't all shout at once again. You're really... Okay, so not many, I hear. That's a terrible waste, because the most valuable resource in the entire country are the brains of 10 million Belgian citizens. So if they're not being developed to their total creative potential of genius, then that's a shame. And I want to explain what I mean by genius. Because can you name a genius from the last couple of 100 years? Any old genius? Anyone? Einstein? All right, let's take Einstein. Let's think. Everyone can agree Einstein was a genius. General theory of relativity, perhaps the most famous equation in the history of science, E equals mc squared, that led to the development of the atomic bomb. Now, wouldn't he have been a greater genius if he had developed a means to prevent human beings from ever using atomic bombs? Yes, he would be hailed as an amazing genius. Or maybe you have a heart surgeon who can perform quadruple bypass heart surgery, but wouldn't they be a greater genius if they could prevent cardiovascular disease? Or maybe you have a police officer who, like Sherlock Holmes, can solve every crime. Wouldn't they be a greater genius if they could prevent crime? Every single student who goes through consciousness-based education, they know how to prevent heart disease. Not just on an intellectual level, but on a practical level. They know how to prevent crime. Not just on an intellectual level, but on a practical level. They know how to prevent human conflict. Again, on a practical level. So every student who goes through consciousness-based education and has the experience of the source of thought is, in that broader sense of the word, a genius. So this is for everybody. Whether you're a brilliant student or you have learning disorders, it doesn't matter. As long as you can think a thought, you can experience that field of total knowledge within. So where do we go from here? Well, it's very simple. We've pointed out that the source of objective existence and the source of subjective existence are the same, that this field of total knowledge within is the field of the total knowledge of the whole universe. So let's see what happens to your brain when you have the experience of the field of total knowledge within. Let's see what happens to your mental abilities. Well, firstly, here's someone meditating, here's the brain. What happens to the brain? Well, the brain is the most amazing organ we know of in the whole universe, and the brain is more like a river than it is like a rock. You might think, oh, I have the same brain today as I had yesterday. No, you don't. About 70% of all of the neuronal connections in your brain today are different than they were yesterday. And every single thing that you do changes your brain. So let's suppose you're born in Brussels. You're born with your genetic heritage, 100 billion neurons. And then after 8 months, your brain has wired up so that you can understand Dutch. Whereas if you're born in Paris, you get a completely different brain. Your brain has wired up so you can understand French. You get a different brain in Paris than you do in Brussels. You probably noticed that. You get a different brain wherever you're born, based on your experience. So if you take violin lessons, then the area of the brain responsible for moving the fingers of the left hand forms billions of new connections compared to the area that moves the fingers of the right hand. Or if you send a student to mathematics, it enlivens certain areas in the left side of the brain. They go to art, it enlivens areas in the right side of the brain. But this fragmented approach to knowledge, this, and this, results in fragmented brain development. Nothing is offered in schools today to develop the whole brain. So we can go from here and say that if fragmented knowledge results in fragmented brain development, then the experience of the unified field of total knowledge within should result in total brain development. Let's see if it does. So here's the brain, and this is going to be the simplest neuroscience lecture you've ever heard. There are basically two parts to the brain. There's the back of the brain here, which is often referred to as the animal brain. It's the part of the brain that we have in common with animals. So if you were interested, I mean you're not interested, but if you were, in knowing the difference between me and a cow, you could study that for your PhD. And it's not a simple question, because I can walk, I have a motor system, a cow can walk, I can see, a cow can see, I can eat, a cow can eat, I can go moo, a cow can go moo. There's a lot of similarities between me and a cow. What is the big difference? Well, the big difference is the prefrontal cortex. Human beings have a much more fully developed prefrontal cortex than a cow. This is our chief executive officer. And the prefrontal cortex governs the animal brain. We have more white matter than a cow. We have more connections between the prefrontal cortex and the animal brain. So if education does not develop the whole brain, we can end up with human beings who behave inhumanely. And that is history. Pick up any history book of Belgian history, and what do you read? One group of human beings behaving inhumanely to another group of human beings. And that's because education worldwide has not been developing the whole brain. We're called humans because we're humane. We're not inhumans. We shouldn't be inhumane. The only difference, ultimately, from a neuroscience point of view, between a saint and a sinner, is how fully developed is your prefrontal cortex. Because this area of the brain is responsible for the highest human values. Judgment, decision-making, planning. You've never seen a cow packing a suitcase and planning a vacation. Impulse control, moral reasoning. That's a prefrontal cortex function. It's not something that's very easy to teach, actually, moral reasoning. For example, have you ever been arrested?
No.
No. That's really lucky, because when the person says yes, it gets really embarrassing. Then you have to go through the whole rap sheet, and it takes us totally off track. So thank you very much. This lady here has never been arrested. Now, do you know all of the laws on the statutes of the European Union and Belgium? No. You don't even know what I'm talking about. Good. So, no, you don't know all the laws. In fact, probably hardly know any of the laws. Even lawyers don't know all the laws. And yet, without knowing the law, you've been able to live your life so far without getting arrested. Isn't that amazing? Why is that? It's because you're very fortunate. Your prefrontal cortex has developed sufficiently so that when you act to fulfill your individual desires, you spontaneously take into account the feelings of other people. But what if you go to a local prison and you say to the prisoner, "Did you know that stealing cars was wrong?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I knew it was wrong. So why did you do it?" "Oh, I don't know." And then it gets very confusing. And the thing is, the ultimate reason was, even though they knew the law, they couldn't obey the law because of lack of prefrontal cortex development. But every prisoner in Belgium went to school somewhere. It's not the prisoner's fault. They turned up at kindergarten innocent, ready to learn. The education system failed to develop the whole brain. That's a great tragedy for society. So let's see what happens to the brain when we experience the field of total knowledge within during the practice of transcendental meditation. Here's Dr. Fred Travis, one of the world's experts in the EEG, looking at hopefully a willing subject. She looks kind of all right. And each of these little metal things here are the electrodes, and they're measuring the electrical activity on the surface of the scalp. So it's a few microvolts. And what they do is they feed this raw data into the computer, they Fourier analyze it, and they calculate what's called coherence. And coherence is a measure of the degree of connectivity between different cortical regions. If the brain waves are coherent for a period of time, then we can conclude that each area of the brain is communicating with each other. So we're really looking to see, does the left side know what the right side is doing? And when we look at, and this is from the journal Cognitive Processing, actually I'm going to show you a little video right here. I'm going to show you a video of the raw data. So what we're seeing here is this is the raw data from the electrode on the prefrontal cortex left side. And you can see there's a few microvolts and a certain amplitude of signal. And then this is the raw data from the prefrontal cortex electrode on the right side. So the fact that this isn't a straight line means that the neurons here are firing a little bit coherently and the signal is adding together. And the same thing here, the signal is adding together. And then here, this is a computer-generated plot looking at the coherence between the left side and the right side. And this coherence here can run from 100% down to 0%. So you see here, sitting with eyes closed, that the coherence is fluctuating from high to low and back to high. And then when the subjects start to meditate, here we see them beginning to meditate right here. They're practicing transcendental meditation now. Their awareness has dived within to that field of pure silent awareness, transcendental consciousness. You see the local coherence increases, left and right, and you see here the coherence between the left and right goes up, and then it stabilizes out between 95 and 100%. This is a completely unique style of brain functioning in the prefrontal cortex that you only see during the practice of transcendental meditation. So let's look at it from another perspective, and we can look at it from this study in cognitive processing. And here we see alpha coherence are global coherence maps. So here with eyes open, you see there's a little bit of coherence between these electrodes. With eyes closed, there's a little bit more coherence as the mind settles down. And this is during transcendental meditation. Within just a few seconds of starting transcendental meditation, the whole brain becomes globally coherent between the left side and the right side in the prefrontal cortex, between the prefrontal cortex and the occipital cortex. The whole brain is now functioning holistically. And this is really the whole story. The student comes to school, or the office worker comes to the office, or the police officer comes to the police station, or the judge comes to the courtroom. Who knows what type of brain they have? Maybe they didn't sleep well. Maybe they played video games all night. Maybe they didn't have breakfast. Who knows? So then before school or before work, 15 to 20 minutes of transcendental meditation, the whole brain becomes coherent, and then they study physics and mathematics and art and philosophy and economics with a coherent brain. And then before they go home in the afternoon, 15, 20 minutes of transcendental meditation, then they go out into society and home to their family with a coherent brain. And I understand from parents of teenagers that this is greatly appreciated. So this is the new face of education, creating coherence in the brain and then studying, so that you're studying from a higher level of awareness. Now, what's very fascinating is this is a study from the International Journal of Neuroscience looking at frontal brain coherence over a 1-year period. Now remember, everything you do changes your brain. So practicing transcendental meditation changes your brain. It's like anything else. Now this is looking at the frontal coherence with eyes closed at rest before the students learnt transcendental meditation. And this little yellow line here is the coherence in the prefrontal cortex while the students have their eyes open and they're solving a problem. Then they're tested again after 2 months. This is the coherence during transcendental meditation, and this is the coherence outside of meditation, solving a problem. And then this is after 6 months, and this is after 1 year. Now notice how these two graphs are different. What does this one tell us? Well, it tells us that once you've learned transcendental meditation, you don't get better at meditation over time. Someone who's been meditating for 2 days is as good a meditator as someone who's been meditating for 20 years, because the meditation is effortless. It's simple. It's natural. You don't get better at it. It doesn't get better with practice. It's good the first time you ever do it. But look what happens outside of meditation. These students here have roughly 50% more coherence in their brain than they did at the beginning of the year. Now, if you're a teacher in this classroom and your students' brains are 50% more coherent than the students in this teacher's classroom, who's the happy teacher? Which teacher is thinking always about retiring, pension plans, whatever? The thing is that the key to being a successful teacher is to develop fully coherent brain functioning in your students. It makes your life a lot easier, makes their life a lot more successful. And what you see here actually is the growth of a fifth state of consciousness called cosmic consciousness, where the brain is fully coherent not only during meditation, but also outside of meditation, so that you have that experience of pure awareness during sleeping, during dreaming, during waking, and your brain is coherent when you're involved in daily life, so that you can be more successful in daily life. We meditate for the results in our activity rather than the experience in meditation. It's a very practical endeavor that we're doing. So let's go on and look at there are many, many other studies, but just to give you an idea, this is a random assignment study published in the journal Intelligence, where students were randomly assigned into transcendental meditation or another mental technique. And you see, compared to the control group, the transcendental meditation students, after just 6 months, had improved significantly in abstract intelligence, mental efficiency, practical intelligence, field independence, and creativity. So these are all the qualities that you find in a great student, now growing in every student. This is a very exciting study. It was published in the journal Education in 2011. This is looking at the public school system in the United States. This particular study was in San Francisco, looking at mathematics achievements in middle school students. And this blue group had been practicing transcendental meditation for the semester, and this group had just been sitting quietly reading a book or putting their head on the desk. And after the semester, you see that over 40% of the students practicing transcendental meditation had improved by at least one performance level on a scale 1 to 5 in mathematics. So it shows us that what's been missing from mathematics teaching is the ability to make the student's brain more coherent. Is anyone here a mathematics teacher? That's probably why nobody has gray hair. Have you ever seen a mathematics teacher? It's a very frustrating thing to be a mathematics teacher because, you know, you have a student and you say, okay, 2x equals 4. What is x? I don't know. All right, let's look at it with some building blocks, okay? So we do it with manipulatives, we do it this way. Then finally, after half an hour, the child says, x equals 2. And you feel so good. So then you say, now, if 4x equals 8, what is x? I don't know, it's too hard, the numbers are too big. And the thing is, when you teach the child transcendental meditation, what happens is the child will go, oh, I get it. Because those areas of the brain associated with analysis and synthesis have become more enlivened. It just makes teaching a joy. I have teachers in their 80s teaching at Maharishi School. They never want to stop teaching. They say that they have more energy at the end of the day than at the beginning of the day because teaching these students who are enthusiastic, well-behaved, considerate, it's just a great experience to be a teacher. The same thing they found with language skills, English achievement. The Transcendental Meditation group significantly improved more than the control group. And people often ask, well, what about children with learning disabilities like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? When we first started teaching children with ADHD, other people said, you can't do this because these children are hyperactive. You'll never get them to sit in a chair and meditate. That's impossible. But it's not impossible because transcending is completely natural. You teach them the technique, the mind dives within, the body gets deeply rested, and there they are sitting restfully alert. And ADHD is a huge problem in the world today. Over 4 million children, maybe 5 or 6 million children in the United States have been diagnosed with ADHD. When I was at school, nobody had ADHD. We were just considered to be a pain in the neck, and the teachers dealt with us however best they could. But today there's probably 3 million children in the United States taking Ritalin or Adderall or Concerta, these very powerful amphetamine drugs, and they recommend that they start them at 5 years old. And there's been no research looking at the long-term effects of these very powerful drugs. Well, it turns out that ADHD is a result of impaired executive function. And where are the executive functions in the brain? In the prefrontal cortex. So as we start to make the prefrontal cortex more coherent, it's not surprising that we start to see a decrease in the symptoms of ADHD. And here's just one study published in the journal Mind and Brain, the Journal of Psychiatry. There's a certain ratio in the brain, theta waves, which are 4 to 8 cycles per second, and beta waves, which are 12 to 20 cycles per second. And there's a ratio called the theta-beta ratio. And in a normal subject, that ratio is about 3. So you can see that these subjects had quite severe ADHD because this ratio has been found to be higher in children with ADHD. So this is a random assignment study where this group began transcendental meditation here and meditated for 6 months. And then this group didn't practice transcendental meditation until here. And then after 3 months they learnt, and then you see the same trend. So after 6 months, the students are almost down to normal. And then we can start working with their psychiatrist and very gradually get them weaned off of the drugs. So it's a very exciting development. Because there's no harmful side effects, there's only side benefits. So, to summarize, we can say everything good about the brain depends on its coherent functioning. Regular practice of transcendental meditation gives experience of transcendental consciousness, and that increases brain coherence. And then that correlates with increased creativity, faster concept learning, better moral reasoning, increased intelligence, decreased neuroticism, depression, anxiety, better exam results, and faster reaction time. So the important point here is that it is only the experience of transcendental consciousness that enlivens total brain functioning. So you'll meet people and they'll say to you, well, I don't need to meditate because after school I go swimming and that refreshes me and I feel great, relaxed after swimming. And they do, and I would certainly recommend a good swim. It's not going to do anyone any harm, but swimming does not develop the whole brain. It's different to transcendental meditation. Other people would say, I like to sit on the sofa with a banana cream pie and a glass of wine and I feel great. Yes, that's great, but it's not the practice of transcendental meditation and it will not develop your whole brain. It's only, interestingly enough, the experience of pure silent inner wakefulness that develops the whole brain. And what is the one thing that students never have at school these days? The experience of quiet, silent inner wakefulness. The one thing that we've missed for thousands of years. And now, fortunately, we have it. So let's look and see what happens to health. Now, this should interest those of you who are over the delicate age of 40 or so, because children in general, they're quite healthy. I mean, we worry about child safety, but the vast majority of children are super healthy, running around, etc., etc. But what about the poor old teachers? Teaching is a very stressful job, and I've had teachers say to me, forget the kids, give me this. Let's just wait, forget the kid. So let's look at health, and we know that the vast majority of disorders in society today are related to stress, and that includes cancer, diabetes, breakdown in the immune system, alcohol and substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, insomnia, ulcers, depression, anxiety. You could make a list 100 miles or 100 meters long. Doesn't matter. But it doesn't take much to realize that if we now have a technique to give the opposite experience of stress, then we should be able to prevent the vast majority of stress-related disorders. So the first study to look at health was really in 1987, published in the Journal of Psychosomatic Medicine, looking at hospital admission rates amongst a group of 2,000 people practicing transcendental meditation and a matched control group by Blue Cross Blue Shield Insurance in the United States. Now you see here, this is childbirth, and you see there's no difference in the hospital admission rate for the two groups. You might get disturbed if there was a difference. What it tells you is that the meditating group are not philosophically opposed to going to hospitals. If you need to go to the hospital, they go to the hospital. But look here, this is heart disease. It's 87% less in the group practicing transcendental meditation. Injuries are less. Are injuries stress-related? Yes, most of them are, because you're late for an appointment, you're worried that you're going to be late and everyone's going to be upset with you, you rush out, you fall down the stairs. You're late for an appointment, you run a red light. I mean, all of these things are related to stress. And then you have tumors are less, every category of disease is less. And this was so highly statistically significant, it was really the shot heard around the world. People just woke up to the fact, hey, maybe now we have a non-medicinal or non-pharmacological way of preventing disease. I'm only going to show you a little fraction of the total studies. This is for the baby boomers here, to give you hope. This is a study with people who were over the age of 65 when they learned transcendental meditation. This was a study done with the health insurance statistics in Quebec, published in the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality. So these two groups were studied here for 8 years, and then this group learned transcendental meditation. And then over the next 5 years, this is a cumulative 78% reduction in healthcare utilization in people over the age of 65. Now, I don't want to give you an impression that you can eat, drink, and be merry till you're 65 and then you can put off learning Transcendental Meditation. The point is, though, that it's the baby boomers like me who are turning 65 who are going to swamp the healthcare systems of virtually every Western nation in the world. And I know that ministers of health are very, very worried. I just met with a minister of health the other day, and I said the obvious. I said, you have a freight train coming towards you. You know, in the next 30 years, the baby boomers are going to swamp your healthcare system, and you just can't afford it. He said, I know. He said, but I have 2 freight trains coming towards me. He said, I've not only got the baby boomers to worry about, he said, we have the most unhealthy group of 20-year-olds and teenagers we've ever had. They're now coming in with adult onset diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, obesity, and he said, I'm getting very unpopular because I keep taking money from education, infrastructure building, and what am I going to do? So I said, well, you're going to learn Transcendental Meditation. So he did, and introduced it to the administration in the health department, and now more and more of those people are studying how to introduce it into high-risk groups, such as the elderly, for example. Now, this is a very exciting study that makes me jump up and down with excitement. This was published last month in the journal Cardiology. It's a random assignment study. It's a randomized clinical trial where 201 adults who had been diagnosed with heart disease were randomly assigned to either health education or Transcendental Meditation. And after 5 years, there was a 48% reduction in mortality, heart attack, and stroke in the group that had been randomly assigned to Transcendental Meditation. So if you're ever asked to participate in a study and they say you're in the health education group, I would kick up a fuss if I was you. Now, this is just looking at the group as a whole. Now, when they looked at those who had meditated at least once a day, because they were told to meditate twice a day, so they said, okay, let's look at those who'd meditated at least once a day over 5 years. Then there was a 66% reduction in heart attack, stroke, and death. Now, if this was a pill, they'd be handing it out on every street corner. They'd be grinding it up and putting it in your drinking water. It would be hailed as the greatest pharmaceutical discovery of the scientific age, but it's Transcendental Meditation. And we've been brought up in an age of pharmaceuticals. So it takes time for the older people like me, for their brains to kind of cotton on to the fact that there's a non-pharmaceutical way now of preventing heart disease. But of course, governments are going to be forced financially to introduce Transcendental Meditation into the health system. And already we have some progress in the United States. Several insurance companies are now paying for people to learn Transcendental Meditation, because if you own an insurance company, you can see immediately if my clients are practicing Transcendental Meditation, I'm going to make a lot more money. It's quite mercenary, but that's the way they think. That's how they are. So it's very exciting. We now have really a way of making education prevention oriented. And when you teach it to young people, this is looking at reduced high blood pressure in high school students. Many high school students, a good fraction, are now hypertensive already. And this was published in the American Journal of Hypertension. And high blood pressure amongst teenagers and 20-year-olds is strongly correlated with coronary artery disease later in life. So you see, here's the systolic pressure of the control group over 8 months. This is the systolic pressure of the TM group over 8 months. This is the summer holiday where there's no follow-up, and you see when they come back, the blood pressure is still low. So now it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that we're teaching this in schools, and by teaching this in schools, we can now make education prevention oriented, and we will actually essentially eliminate, statistically anyway, these very serious diseases from future generations. So that's why everyone's getting so excited about the whole thing. Let's look finally at social behavior. Now, how would Transcendental Meditation change social behavior? Has anyone here ever met someone who's stressed? Have you ever met someone who's okay? So you know that their behavior may be different. You know, you go in and they're really stressed out, and you just turn around and you tiptoe out and hope they haven't noticed that you were there. Because people who are highly stressed, you know, they're more likely to lose their temper at you, they're more likely to hit you, they're more likely to smoke too much or drink too much and do all these silly things, have accidents more. So it's pretty obvious that when the person is feeling more unbounded, more calm, more settled, they have more creativity to solve their problems, that their social behavior is going to improve. And this is what we see in study after study. For example, we find that transcendental meditation is the most effective way of reducing anxiety. That this is a study from Stanford University looking at 146 published studies. They did a meta-analysis. They found transcendental meditation was by far the most effective way in reducing anxiety compared to other mental techniques. The same thing with other antisocial behavior, such as cigarette smoking. You might wonder, well, why does someone who practices transcendental meditation reduce the amount of cigarettes? Because when you learn to meditate, your transcendental meditation teacher doesn't go, you've got to give up smoking. They don't even mention it. But what happens is, it's a very subtle thing. The nature of the human mind is to always go towards greater happiness. Whether you like it or not, that's what your mind is doing. Nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, yesterday was awful, I hope today is worse. Right? That would be very unusual. I mean, today might be worse, but that's not what we want. We want more happiness. So if you have someone who's feeling a little bit agitated or depressed or tired or whatever it is, and they light up a cigarette, they take a puff, and you see them, they go, I feel so much better. Why are they doing that? Well, because it makes them feel better, but only in the short term. In the long term, it's going to make them feel a lot worse. The point is, after they've learned transcendental meditation, what happens? They wake up in the morning, practice transcendental meditation, dive into that ocean of bliss deep within, they come out, they feel revitalized, rejuvenated, they have more energy, more happiness, they're going down the road, and the thought doesn't come, boy, I need a cigarette. So after a few months, cigarette smokers report that they look inside their package and they say, but I've only smoked half my package and I didn't even realize. It happens naturally. And the same thing with alcohol abuse. Transcendental meditation is now being used in alcohol rehabilitation centers because it's so effective compared to standard treatment programs and standard prevention programs. Same thing with illegal drug use. People take illegal drugs because it makes them feel good in the short term. Transcendental meditation makes you feel better. So we could say in summary that we see improved social behavior as increased tolerance, increased self-esteem, greater self-development, greater moral maturity, increased self-actualization. This is a study in Canada showing improved tolerance in high school students after just 14 weeks of transcendental meditation compared to controls. Greater appreciation of others, decreased anxiety, decreased depression, reduced behavior problems in schools. This is from health and quality of life outcomes, looking at decreased absenteeism, decreased rule infractions, decreased suspension days. And it's really remarkable. When this gets put in schools, the whole climate of the school completely changes. What we do is we start firstly with the principal of the school. They learn to meditate because they have to know what the program is. Then we instruct those teachers who want to learn. And I was just in Holland and speaking with a school principal where the teachers had been instructed and we hadn't yet got to the students. And he said, you know, it's amazing. I've seen so many changes already just with the teachers meditating. He said, the other day I had a couple of boys in my office for some disciplinary meeting, and a teacher came in and said to the boys, have you seen my briefcase? And they said, yes, miss, we left it in your locker. You left it in the classroom. And she said, thank you, and left. And then one boy turned to the other and he said, she doesn't shout at us anymore. So the children notice right away when the teachers have learnt to meditate. So now all over the world, students are meditating in schools. This is in the United Kingdom. This is the Maharishi School in Skelmersdale, a suburb of Liverpool. And This school is now 100% funded by the British government. The British government are not only paying all the teacher salaries, all the operating expenses, they're now building new schools. And so not only at this school, but also in London and in Suffolk, there are going to be new consciousness-based schools, 100% paid for by the British government. Why is this? Because over the last 25 years, the government have noticed that the consciousness-based schools outperform all the other schools in Britain. A recent article in the Liverpool Echo, which is the newspaper that covers Liverpool, said that the exam results of the Morrishy School put those of Eton and Westminster to shame. Now, Eton is probably the most famous school in England. It's where the Prime Minister went, actually. And Westminster is where the Deputy Prime Minister went. And they're very elite private schools, very expensive to get into, otherwise you have to be very brilliant to get into or very well connected. These children are from the suburbs of Liverpool, not internationally renowned for its intellectual prowess. And yet these students are outperforming the elite students. Why? Because these students are developing their whole brains. And it's not just in academics. You know, there have been several instances recently of well-known Eton graduates doing things in Las Vegas that might have embarrassed the family. Eton, because it doesn't develop the whole brain, it doesn't necessarily develop the moral reasoning skills. So many of the top bankers went to Eton. No, just pointing it out, you know. People have been complaining for years that Masters in Business Administration doesn't teach ethical behavior. It's missing in conventional education. It's consciousness-based education. You get both. You get the academics, you get the social behavior, you get the moral reasoning as well. And you get even more than that, if you can believe, because you can all understand when I talked about individual stress, that a person individually who's stressed has a different behavior pattern to a person who has less stress. But what you have to understand now is something you've never really thought about, perhaps, and that is that from a physics perspective, everything in the universe is a field. So you're quite happy when I talk about the electromagnetic field. If the electrons in that chandelier are tickling the electromagnetic field, then I get light over here. Gravitational field. Everyone's happy with the fact that that pervades all of space and time. But what's less known is, for example, the electron field. If I have this little laser pointer here, every electron in this laser pointer is not just an individual electron. It's actually a fluctuation of an unbounded abstract electron field. The electron field is universal. It's just not fluctuating very much here. When you get to here, it fluctuates a lot. And then down here, it isn't fluctuating very much. Every single thing in nature is a field, and consciousness is no exception. Consciousness is also a field. You have the sensation that you have your own individual consciousness, and you do. Every person is different. You have your own individual consciousness. But it's just like waves on an ocean. This wave is different to this wave, which is different to this wave. But every wave is an expression of one single underlying field. So today we talk about the field of consciousness. We can talk about individual consciousness. We talk about collective consciousness. And we can talk about the collective consciousness of Belgium, which is comprised of the sum of the individual consciousnesses of 10 million Belgian citizens. So you can talk about Belgian collective consciousness. And you travel over the border to Holland, different collective consciousness. You feel it as soon as you go across the border. Go to Germany, different collective consciousness. Go to France, different collective consciousness. So intuitively, we do experience different collective consciousness. And if the individuals in the nation are stressed, then the collective consciousness will be stressed. So if you got off the plane today in Damascus, you would experience a highly stressed collective consciousness. If you go to Tahiti, it'll feel completely different, maybe stressed in a different way there. So every nation has its own collective consciousness. And for Belgium, it's very important to understand that you get the government that you deserve, because the government is an innocent mirror of the collective consciousness of the nation. If the collective consciousness is divided, then the government will be divided. If the collective consciousness is incoherent, the government will be incoherent. So how to make the government more coherent? Create coherence in the collective consciousness. Now, how do we do that? Well, obviously, up to now what I've said, it'll be obvious to everyone that if all 10 million citizens in Belgium learnt Transcendental Meditation, healthcare costs would go down, all of the negative social behavior would go down, productivity would go up, intelligence, creativity, entrepreneurship. It would be a transformation in the collective consciousness of the nation. But what the research has shown is that you don't need to have 10 million Belgian citizens practicing Transcendental Meditation to see a measurable increase in the coherence in collective consciousness. The research shows that you need about 1%. So 100,000 people would be enough. And about 50 studies have shown that about 1% of the population practicing Transcendental Meditation is enough to induce a phased transition to lower crime, lower accidents, lower sickness rates, lower alcohol consumption, lower divorce rate, etc., etc. Now, 100,000 people is a lot of people. Stein and I, it might take us a while to even talk to 100,000 people. And then, have you ever tried to persuade someone to do something? Like, have you ever seen a politician arguing with another politician? How many times have you ever seen a politician persuade another politician to change their mind? You can't persuade people on the level of the intellect. It's much deeper than that. But people do start Transcendental Meditation because it's a very logical thing, and the research is overwhelming now. So 100,000 might be possible, 1% of 10 million. But it's even better than that. What's been found is that when Transcendental Meditation and its advanced techniques, including yogic flying, are done in a group, then you only need the square root of 1% of the population to create coherence in the collective consciousness. Now, how is that possible? Well, it's because this is science. This is physics. Now, think if I take a body of water, let's say, and I had a stone for every time that one of the 100,000 Belgians practiced Transcendental Meditation. Right? So at 6 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Van der Bosch is practicing over here, so I drop them in, all right? And then, Mrs. De Laurent is practicing over here or whatever. So you're dropping these little stones in, and what's going to happen is the whole field is going to start to become enlivened. The whole lake will be starting to have ripples. But if instead of taking those 100,000 stones and dropping them in at different times of day in different places, what happens if I drop in one stone? I get a wave with an amplitude of 1. If I drop in 2 stones together at exactly the same time and same place, I'll get an amplitude of 2. But here's the physics. The power of the effect is equal to the square of the amplitude. So if I drop in 2, I get a power of 4. If I drop in 3, I get a power of 9. If I drop in 350, I get the power of 100,000. So in fact, it turns out that we only need to get 350 Belgian citizens practicing Transcendental Meditation and TM cities and yogic flying together in a group twice a day to create coherence in the collective consciousness. Now, where do you find 350 Belgian citizens who come to the same place at the same time every day? In schools. So it's amazing that the young people, who we never really thought were that useful until they got a degree and contributed to society, it's going to be the young people who are going to be creating the coherence in the collective consciousness for the rest of us. Of course, that doesn't stop you. If you own a business, you should have your own employees meditate twice a day. If you're in prison, get everyone to meditate twice a day. If you're in the military, get everyone to meditate twice a day, etc. So let me show you the effects. We predicted ahead of time to the local police and local government that when this group of students, back in 1988, came together, started meditating together, and the community in Skelmersdale started doing yogic flying together, that this would decrease the crime in Merseyside. And of course they said that's impossible. So we did the experiment anyway, published it in the Journal of Psychology, Crime and Law. This is the raw data looking at crime in Merseyside from 1979 to 1991. And what you see is the crime goes up in the summer, down in the winter. This is the raw data, it's going like this. And then this is March of 1988 when the group formed, and immediately you see a phase transition to a completely different trend of crime. And we've seen this all the time. Every time a group forms, we see exactly the same thing. Inspired by that, Dr. George Rutherford in Washington, D.C., introduced Transcendental Meditation into a public school in Washington. It was in southeast Washington at a time when Washington was known as the murder capital of America. This was back in 1992. And he said he was always outside breaking up fights. His children would get shot coming to school because rival housing estates were firing at each other. It was absolutely chaos. He came to visit Maharishi School in Fairfield. He was immediately struck by the fact that we had happy children. He said, I can make my children happy. So he went back, introduced Transcendental Meditation. Not only did the violence in the school and in the playground go down, but the violence went down in the whole community. So inspired by that, Dr. John Hagelin decided to do the largest sociological experiment in history, as far as we can tell. And he went to the FBI and he said, what we're going to do is we're going to decrease violent crime in Washington by more than 20% next July. And he was very politely received and politely shown to the exit. And then he went to the police chief, and the police chief said, it will take 2 feet of snow in July to decrease crime by 20%. But Dr. Hagelin was persistent, and he went to many scientists, he went back to the FBI, he went to the police, and eventually they agreed that they would participate in the study. They would be authors on the study. So back in 1993, this is the crime in Washington, D.C. This is starting in January, and the solid line is the actual crime, and the dotted line is the predicted crime based on time series analysis of the previous years. And you can see it's amazing how accurate time series analysis is. So this is where the group started to arrive, and Dr. Hagelin had predicted for a big effect to have 4,000 people. So this is the first part. People started arriving. We had about 800 here. And then the number rose to about 2,400, and you can start to see now a difference between the predicted crime and the actual. And then this is where the 4,000 arrived. And then you see that characteristic phase transition, and much lower, about 22% lower than the predicted crime. And then once the group went home, the crime started to climb back up again. So we've seen this many times, and this is highly statistically significant. You can see this is 0.0, so that would be 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. So less than 1 part in 10,000 that this is due to a statistical chance. So it's all from this experience of transcending. You're enlivening coherence in that most fundamental field, which is the source of everyone's thought and the source of all the laws of nature in the environment. So let's finally see what happens now for the benefits for society and world peace. This is Maharishi School in Lelystad in Holland. It's just up the road. I invite you to go and visit. You'll see these lovely children meditating twice a day. This is in Belfast. All of these children had been expelled from the regular system. There was also a group of boys. I went to Belfast full of enthusiasm for getting transcendental meditation in the schools, and I was told that Belfast is a pragmatic city and that perhaps transcendental meditation would not be what they would want. But fortunately, I saw in the newspaper an article that was talking about a school principal who had opened up a school for students who had been expelled from the other schools. And I immediately thought, well, you have to be pretty creative to get expelled from a school in Belfast. I would imagine this principal has some problems. So we called him up. He said, come on over. When we got there, he said, well, thanks for coming. You're lucky you didn't get shot. They don't like strangers on these housing estates. So we said, thank you very much. Thank you for telling us that. Within 10 minutes, he said, we'll do it. Just like that. That's enough. We'll do it. So the TM teachers went in. They gave an introductory lecture to the students. They said it was the wildest thing they'd ever seen in their lives. The boys were jumping on the desks, throwing chairs at each other. They didn't listen to a single word that was said. They took them in one by one, instructed them one-on-one, and immediately they all transcended. It was just completely quiet. The principal had never seen anything like it. He started to tell the other principals. Now there are several schools in Belfast that have introduced Transcendental Meditation, and Jerry Adams, the head of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, he started Transcendental Meditation a couple of months ago. He wants everyone to know, said that he's experienced inner peace now. He's going to spend the rest of his life working to create peace. And now both sides have learnt Transcendental Meditation, and we have permission now to build a consciousness-based school on the Peace Line, right on the border of the Catholic and Protestant areas of Belfast, and we'll take both Catholic and Protestant students into the same school. So it's going to be a very exciting development in Belfast. This is in Italy. This is the first consciousness-based school in Italy, a public school. And about 120 children have been instructed already, and another 150 are waiting to start. And the principal says the results are amazing. The children are more alive, they're doing better at academics, there's less bullying, there's less anxiety. This is a painting from a little Italian girl. She says, a simple word can change our world that now is lost in darkness and pollution. I love meditation, exclamation mark. This is in San Francisco, where the superintendent said recently he wants transcendental meditation in every single school in the city based on the effects they've seen over the last 5 years in the school system there. These are Native Americans. This is the Ho-Chunk tribe in Nebraska. Native Americans have started because they have a lot of problems with alcohol and drugs, etc. And they experience, when they transcend, that this is bringing them back to the source of their culture, back to the field of all the laws of nature that is within every individual. This is in Australia. This is the Maharishi School in Melbourne, where the government pays 50% of the operating costs of the school. These are Maori students in South Auckland. The Maoris were the first group to start transcendental meditation in a school in New Zealand. The local mayor said the crime has now gone down 38% around this area of the town since they started the program. In fact, the local policeman was quoted in the paper and he said, I was constantly in the school. He said, now I only go there during meditation time to get some peace and quiet. This is in Ghana, and hundreds of students have now started in Kenya, where we're building a Maharishi school in the Rift Valley. These are orphans, AIDS orphans in Uganda. They're all sitting there practicing transcendental meditation. When we first went there, they were very they were almost like they had post-traumatic stress disorder. But they learned to meditate, and now they're coming completely alive. We've also had programs for Congolese refugees in Uganda. And Dr. Fred Travis is publishing a paper in the Journal of Stress and Trauma, where he's done a random assignment study and found within 30 days all of the symptoms of PTSD are down to normal in the group that learned transcendental meditation. This is South Africa, where tens of thousands of students have learned in Johannesburg. These are Buddhist students, but they're now doing transcendental meditation because they found it's completely effortless, it's natural. A Buddhist monk from Japan became a teacher of transcendental meditation. He's now taught 4,000 Buddhist monks transcendental meditation. And what do they experience? Well, in Japan, they say, oh, I experienced Satori. In India, they say, oh, I've experienced Samadhi. In Nepal, they might say, I've experienced Nirvana. In Christian countries, people say, oh, I've experienced that peace that passes all understanding, the light of God within. It doesn't matter what language you use to describe it, it's the same experience. It's a universal experience, because every human being has something in common. They can all think thoughts. And when they transcend thoughts, they experience the source of thought, which is that unified field which is underlying everything. These are Muslim students in Indonesia, Arab students in Israel. This was a great story. An Arab principal came to one of our presentations. He got so excited and he said, I've got to have this, I've got to have this. So we tried to get visas for Arabic-speaking teachers to come to Israel, but that's not easy. So we used our Jewish teachers of TM to teach the Arab students, and it worked great. And this school got the award from the Ministry of Education for the most reduced violence of any school in Israel in the first year of the program. These are Palestinians from Bethlehem and Ramallah meditating together to reduce the social stress in that area. This is Brazil, where the Ministry of Education have now asked for Transcendental meditation to be taught in 38,000 schools in Brazil. And they keep asking why we're taking so long. They want it done right away, and so if you speak Portuguese, please see me afterwards. This is in Peru. This is the Zapotec tribe in southern Mexico on the border with Guyana. And about 8,000 students there have now learnt Transcendental meditation and also yogic flying. And this tribe is closely linked to the Mayans and the Incas. And on the 21st of December, at the end of the Mayan calendar, we had 8,000 students doing yogic flying together up on the holy mountain. And the president of Ecuador said that the end of the Mayan calendar is not the end of the world. It's the end of the age of selfishness and the beginning of the age of selflessness. And that was symbolized by having this group. Why 8,000? Because that's basically the square root of 1% of the world's population. So they could have an influence of decreasing stress in the whole world. So I'm really glad you came. You didn't expect to hear what you've heard. But what you can look forward to is stress-free schools. And the way in which we introduce this into schools is very systematic. The first thing we do is we instruct the principal. So the principal has to learn, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't know what was going on. The principal learns Transcendental meditation, then introduces it to the teachers who want to learn. Once we have more than half of the teachers meditating, the teachers can meet in a group and they vote whether they want to go the next step and introduce it to the students. And then if they do, then they go to the school board, they get permission from the school board, then they go to the parents and knowledge meetings are held for the parents. And then those parents who want their child to meditate, they sign a permission slip. If parents don't want their children to meditate, they don't have to, they just sit quietly. The whole school then institutes what we call quiet time. So the children meditate or they sit quietly. And because Transcendental meditation is so enjoyable, by the end of the year, most of the students are meditating, vast majority. And then immediately you see a change in the whole school climate. Principals say to me, before we started Transcendental meditation, my teachers were taking their own quiet time every other Thursday, Wednesday afternoons. He said, since we started Transcendental meditation, my teacher attendance is virtually 100%. Attendance from the school. Yes?
Do you always ask the permission of the parents?
If the child is under 18, yes.
Is this mandatory?
For us, from our foundation, it's mandatory if the child is under 18 to get...
Tell us why?
I'm sorry?
Why?
Oh, why? Well, I think because we want to make sure that the family are completely in agreement. I wouldn't want to teach a child and then have a parent come in and say, you never asked my permission. I mean, the legal age is 18, so...
And if let's say the child of 15, 16 wants to join the group,
And doesn't have permission. That's an interesting question. No, we would still have to have parental permission, but we would go and sit down with the parents and explain with the child why the child wanted to learn. I don't think that's ever come up, actually. I mean, most teenage parents, they're really happy that their child is going to learn to meditate, because most teenage parents are very worried about the things that their child is getting up to. So when you explain that they're going to drink less, smoke less, do less drugs, be better at school, become more intelligent and creative, it's a very rare parent who says, I don't want that. So, yeah, no, I would be very nervous about teaching someone without parental permission if they're under 18. And then if the child is under 10, then we require one of the parents to also learn to meditate. And if they're 10, then they can get parental permission. And then it's done. So when you think about it, in Belgium, you have schools with 3,000 students. So you can take care of the whole of Europe from here, which is really what Belgium is supposed to be doing.
There's not any school for the moment in Belgium that does this.
We've made a lot of progress in the last week. We have several schools that are very interested now.
And the ministers? You talk with the ministers too? Or?
The government is an innocent mirror of the collective consciousness of the nation.
Do they know about this?
They might, but it's not that they're very busy doing whatever they do. They may not have time to meet with us, but we're not worried about them at the moment. The thing is, we can govern the government by creating coherence in the collective consciousness. So we only need one principal who, with some vision and some organizing power, and the school itself can take care of the whole country. And that's what we've been doing in most countries.
Go underneath to go up?
Well, not underneath. We get permission. Yeah, in a sense. We create collective consciousness in the whole environment, and then the government is a mirror of that. Now, of course, in some countries where we've had big programs for several years, like Brazil, now the government has come out and said we want it everywhere. Same in Ecuador. Now we're getting good progress in Mexico. The government in the United States is starting to support. The government in Britain is starting to support.
Because is it expensive for the school?
Expensive for the school? Well, ultimately, there are obviously going to be startup costs, and I'll explain that in a moment. But once the thing gets stabilized, then what we do is, once the teachers have learned Transcendental Meditation, then naturally a couple of teachers say, hey, I'd like to teach this. So then we have a teacher training course to train the teachers to teach Transcendental Meditation. Then they're on the payroll of the school, and then essentially it doesn't cost the school anything. The cost is in the initial startup where we have to provide the teaching of Transcendental Meditation, and we need to provide roughly 2 teachers for every 400 students. So, those teachers need to get a salary of about the same rate as the teachers at the school. So that's the initial cost. Yeah?
During how many? During 1 year? Or?
Okay. Let's say if we can get the teachers in the school onto a teacher training program, yes, that would be for a year. More likely it'll be 2 years. Because the teachers at the school can't, the teacher training is 5 months for Transcendental Meditation. So generally, they'll learn to meditate, and then on their first summer vacation, they'll go on the first half of the course, and then they'll come back and do, practical work with meditation at school, and then they'll go the second summer and become teachers fully, and then they'll take over at the school.
And when the head of the school,
the principal.
Doesn't agree, because we have it in our school.
If the principal doesn't agree, then there's 2 things. One is we just go to another school. The other thing is that if there are some teachers at the school who really feel it's a good idea, then they would learn to meditate, and then they would go in a group to see the principal. And if the principal still isn't interested, then we would teach some parents, and then the parents go and see the principal, and that usually does the trick. So yeah, we can be persistent, but the whole thing has to come from within. It has to be, so we want the school board to approve, we want the administration and the teachers and the parents to approve, not to have a lot of division of people saying, I didn't want this and this and that. But it's not so hard to get approval, but we start with those who want to learn. Every principal has a few teachers who like them. And so, they say, hey, I'd like to get you to learn Transcendental Meditation. And they say, hey, Jacques, you're crazy, but I love you. I'll do it. And then once a few teachers have learnt, then what happens is when Mr. Grumpy comes in with a big smile on his face, the other teachers say, what happened to him? And then naturally it just spreads. That's how it works. Because you don't have to wait to see the results. You'll feel different after your very first meditation. And other people very often we'll see a change in you. I've had so many people learn Transcendental Meditation. They learn because they have insomnia or they have anxiety or whatever, and after 3 days they'll come back and say, my wife says I'm much easier to live with. So someone else sees a change in them, even though they may not have seen a change yet in themselves. So it's something that's immediate, something we do. So this is the future of Belgium. It's a very bright future now. So we're almost there. So tonight I'm going to invite all of you to learn Transcendental Meditation as individuals. That's the first step. Change begins within. We do it ourselves first, and then once you've learned, then you can start thinking, how could I approach my principal or whatever, my boss, my military commander, whatever line of work you're in. And then Steen and the other governors here in Belgium will come and give a presentation, and we take it from there. It's expanding very rapidly now. I would say 5 years ago, there were only a handful of schools in the world who had Transcendental Meditation. 10 years ago, there was only a handful of schools that would even let you in the door to even talk about it. So the whole thing has changed dramatically, and it's continuing to change exponentially now. So that's where we are.